I'm supposed to take questions for 15 minutes or so. There are none? Okay, where are you, Richard Pearl? I saw you out there somewhere. Yes?
I'm not sure it's a legitimate question. I say that if I agree that the neocons are an important source of enemies, but it seems the American system is such for every Australian media baron that's around, there's somebody who sells software too and has an equal amount of resources. Maybe these people should be encouraged to use their resources with more progressive ideas, because there's a counterweight that there are many individuals who think differently. But of course, then there are all those other enemies of the UN, which of course you didn't mention, as you said, Kim Jong-il. I'm sure Saddam was the former ID, Charles Taylor, the Inter-Hongwe, and all these other people too.
They're not only enemies of the UN, they're enemies of us, and they're enemies of the civilized world.
Yeah, and also...
and the UN should be an instrument to control them and to restrain them and to erase them. I would hope so. But your reference to the Australian media magnates, you know, I think, I remember, you know, Franklin Roosevelt lived in a time where newspapers were perhaps more important than they are today. And I think Arthur Schlesinger will confirm my understanding that 90% of the newspapers in America were against Roosevelt and actively fought against him for re-election, etc. Now, he used the radio to go above the newspaper strength and to reach the American people. And I think today there's got to be a new method of communication, because if we leave our present political process to money, the forces of the neocons will always win. But I'm very hopeful to see the role of the internet so far in the political process. And I was interested in the election in South Korea, where a man was elected as president pretty much unknown, certainly opposed by the establishment and by many other interests, including ours. And he won election in large part because of his access to the internet. He reached out to the internet and reached the 70 million people of South Korea in a different way and surprised everybody by winning an election. So the question of communication is always there. You know, some people can use television effectively, some can't. Some people have the money to control it and dominate it, and these negative sound bites are the most pathetic example of political discussion that any democracy ever witnessed. Sometimes they're funny. I heard a radio one this morning of a guy imitating Arnold Schwarzenegger, endorsing a candidate in a New Jersey election. I thought that was a wonderful ad, very clever. So maybe people can find clever ways to do it. But we are a country with a constitution committed to free speech and expression. It's the most fundamental freedom of American democracy. If it's curtailed, it's not going to be by us. It's being curtailed by forces in Washington that also should give us deep concern. But I would say that we have to fight this battle confident that that First Amendment gives us strength, not weakness, in winning. Yes?
Given all that you've said about the administration's behavior toward the UN, the current administration, I wonder if you'd comment on the way we attempted, I believe, to get UN approval before we went in, even though last year into Iraq, this year, even though we did what we wanted and went ahead with the war without, even though we couldn't get Security Council approval of what we wanted, or for them to go along with us. And then in the fall of this year, it appears that we look as if we're trying to get the UN to sanction to help us out. It would seem as if the Bush administration is wanting UN approval, if only as at this point, to go ahead. And I wonder if you
Well, I would say that the president's speech on September 12th, a year ago, where he first called upon the UN to enforce its resolutions, was a very effective and important speech. And I think those who have believed that the UN should be an instrument in international governance took heart that the president felt it important that the UN enforce its resolutions. Now, of course, that means all of its resolutions. That's not always easy in the context of the world we live in. But that was an important thing. Then we went to the Security Council, and by a 15-0 vote, we had our concern about Iraq confirmed. But there was a growing suspicion that the American agenda that included Iraq was not to enforce resolutions, but was to enforce regime change. That there was a domestic political dimension to it, and that ultimately the disdain for the multilateral context was shown and exploded in the rhetoric of the various spokesmen of our government, who went up against, tried to make France a scapegoat for their inability to secure a Security Council resolution that would have supported them. But in my judgment, it was handled so badly diplomatically that had it been handled effectively and well, the United Nations would have been with us ultimately, even in the context of a military action against Saddam Hussein. But my point is, and I believe this, that the forces in the administration who were exercising the decision of war were people who did not want to be encumbered by multilateral obligations. They were those who felt that George Bush had made a terrible mistake in not going to Baghdad in 1992, 1991. And so they, I think, pushed aside the United Nations. Remember, it wasn't France. It was Mexico. It was Canada. It was Chile. They couldn't get 9 votes on the Security Council. And then when they thought they had Turkey in their pocket, having offered them an $8 billion package, they didn't even have Turkey. I mean, it seems to me that that should have been a sign of concern that a president of the United States would undertake to understand. Nobody doubted that the United States could defeat Iraq, a country of 260 million people with the most powerful military forces in the world, against a country of 23 million that had been devastated by the war of 1990-91, that had been disarmed essentially by the UN inspectors through those years, over which we had overflight we took overflight rights over 2/3 of the country. I mean, the military defeat of Iraq was something that we should have assumed, whether it took 5 days or 5 weeks, it was going to happen. But it was, what do you do with Iraq when you win that military victory, that a lot of people then, and unfortunately now, say, what are you going to do? And the UN, I think, behaved in a remarkable way. It expressed its doubts. It said to the United States, privately and publicly to a lesser extent, this is an undertaking that has many unforeseen consequences from which all of us may suffer. And don't do this unless we do it together. And we can do it together. And the United States choosing to ignore that has made it very, very difficult to regain a posture that gives it legitimacy that it would have had it taken the trouble to win UN support at the time. Now, of course, the last resolution that's just been passed, again unanimously, reflects, when we say the UN, we mean the countries of the world, the countries of the world who want to express their deep concern that the United States not get hurt in Iraq, who understand that it's very important for us to succeed in the sense, if there's at all any possibility of creating a government responsive to the will of the Iraqi people. That's what that UN vote means. But I don't think anybody's going to run and substitute their sons for ours, or substitute our money for ours either. And I think if we haven't learned the lesson of how to deal with the international community through that, then the Iraq war is much more devastating than we think it's going to be. Yes.
I agree with your point that as a member of the UN, when the U.S. doesn't like something, it can veto a vote and put it off to the side. However, one question I did have was when you talk about the countries in the UN, you mentioned 190 of them. I would say that a majority don't share our values, be it democracy, be it capitalism, human rights, be it views on Israel. How would you then show America to lead an organization where fundamentally the majority of the countries disagree with us?
Well, you know, we always have the alternative to go it alone, as we did in Iraq, right?
But you
I mean,
just
there
said
is a
that
constitutional cost to that. If you didn't want to go with the United Nations into Iraq, Then you had to go to the Congress of the United States and ask for a declaration of war, if you read Robert Byrd and agree with what he says. Now, the UN reflects the world, the imperfect world that we have. You could organize a democratic caucus so that the countries that are democratic and committed to that have a stronger role, perhaps, in many of these issues. But you know, I'm fascinated by the constant reference to the fact that the UN Human Rights Commission was chaired by a Libyan, as though this was one of the great travesties of our modern times. Until I heard Jeane Kirkpatrick say, who had been a member of the American delegation, that the Libyan chairman had acted very fairly and had done very well. No, there is a possibility of redemption. And that's one of the things the United Nations hold out. It's a forum for us to use to sell democratic values, to say to the tyrants of the world how bad they are and how outrageous they are. If we want to invade companies because of amnesty reports, there's a lot of countries we should be invading, including Zimbabwe or Burma, many others. So we have to live not tolerating, but accepting the fact that there are totalitarian forces in the world, because we are not prepared to tear our own country apart in constant warfare. And as to Israel, a very delicate and difficult problem, all of us who are committed to Israel and are determined to protect Israel and who love it should take note that in the UN resolution that called upon Israel to stop the building of the wall, there were only 4 countries who voted against it: the United States, Israel, the Solomon Islands, and the Marshall Islands. Now, if I were an Israeli, I would be concerned that international opinion has become so convulsed about questions like that. And when I read what the Israeli Chief of Staff said in this morning's Times, I think that message is getting across. Yes?
I would like to also address the last person who asked you a question about countries in the UN who are not democracies. I'm of Turkish origin. Turkey voted in its parliament against allowing US forces to go through Turkey, and the US government said, we don't like the way your parliament voted, we want you to vote again, and maybe we will vote the way we want you to vote the next time. Is this the kind of democracy you were talking about?
But I also believe Paul Wolfowitz said, when asked that question, well, if that's how they voted, that's how it is.
That's what he said publicly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, one asks, where is the democracy being reflected? For example, in Spain, where the government supported our invasion of Iraq, but 92% of the people were against it? Is it inappropriate for France or Germany to reflect the will of their people? And was it the will of our people to go into war without an international coalition?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Maybe
check
so.
the numbers say
We'll
yes.
see. We'll see if it
But
was.
that's, no, you will see is not the answer, because you said was it, and that's what, at the time, what the numbers say. What it is later is you could go back and address every question. But what it was at the time was clearly the numbers were that clear.
The numbers, I think, if I'm correct, were a strong majority if done in an international coalition to the UN.
Yes.
No,
Yes. Yes.
I'm afraid so. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador. I was just wondering what would be your response to skeptics who would claim that Clinton administration also had similar position to Kyoto Protocol and International Criminal Court, and in fact that key foreign policy issues were never tabled before the Security Council.
John, could you repeat that? I didn't hear that. Could somebody repeat that, or did my...
I can't hear it.
Oh, maybe you could come up. Would you come up?
Well, yeah. Sorry.
I'm sure it's such a good question. Everybody should hear it. Come up here.
What would you say to skeptics who would claim that Clinton administration had similarly a strong approach against multilateral treaties like Kyoto Protocol or International Criminal Court, and claim that in fact key foreign policy issues were never tabled before the Security Council.
I would agree with them. I think the Clinton administration's handling the UN was nothing to be favorable about. And when I referred to presidents who thought that, you know, people who are against the UN vote that way, but people who are for the UN have many other things, that's President Clinton saying that. I think President Clinton's abdication of the possibility of leadership relating to the UN is shown in the Somalia incident when those soldiers were killed, and letting the UN become a scapegoat for what was clearly an American responsibility. I think the American role in preventing UN interference to help prevent the genocide of Rwanda. I think the failure of the United States to make sanctuaries safe enough for Srebrenica was in large part our unwillingness to provide the resources while providing the words of what was done. So when I talk about presidential leadership, I mean, I'm not excluding President Clinton by any means.
Yeah, we can take one more question.
Yeah. Yes.
If you could talk about how you might see the Security Council's structure and membership evolving in the coming years, or do you see that as something that would be immutable?
I'm not optimistic about what people say is the absolutely essential reform of the Security Council by enlarging it. Clearly, in a rational world, you would have Germany as part of the Security Council as a permanent member, you'd have Japan, you'd have India, you'd have Brazil, you'd have South Africa. Now there are a formula by which those things can be done by enlarging the Security Council and perhaps not making it less effective in the sense of enlarging it. But you know, Italy, the country we all love, was the country that prevented the reform of the Security Council last time, because they saw that if Germany were given a permanent seat, and France and England already had permanent seats, the likelihood of Italy becoming a member of the Security Council was about as remote as Liechtenstein. So they opposed that, because they have a much better chance of getting on the Security Council now while they can rotate it. Now, I've suggested that there's other ways to handle that. You know, we live in an age of modern communication. If the United States really wanted the Security Council to work, you'd expand the process of deliberation and communication. I never forgot the Japanese ambassador saying to me one day, after the Gulf War in 1990-91, where I had strongly supported President Bush, saying that there had been a meeting of the Security Council, and somebody came out and said, Japan's going to give $12 billion. Nobody had talked to Japan. Nobody had brought them into the deliberations of the Security Council. They were now given a bill for $12 billion for the role in the Security Council. Now, Japan didn't have to be a member of the Security Council to involve them in a discussion of something where they had such a tangible and real interest. And that's true with Germany and India and all of these countries. There's a way to work out it, bringing in these countries into the Security Council deliberations so that you could be sure that the votes of the Security Council reflect the consensus of that power. Franklin Roosevelt's idea of a Security Council was that those who had the power in the world had the responsibility of enforcing the peace. That's still true. Now, the countries that have the power today are different than they were in 1945. But it's still true that we have to bring them into that formula. And I think the Security Council has made a big mistake in causing all of its deliberations to be so private and confidential, so that the world no longer has access to what they're talking about. Remember when Adlai Stevenson in the missile crisis came before the United Nations and the Security Council and had that extraordinary confrontation with the Soviet representative, Ambassador Zorin, I think it was? The country was electrified, and so was the world. Why do we think that people are going to be involved with the UN when the UN operates behind a closed, sealed enclosure? Why don't we open it up? If there is a complaint to be made, let the countries against which the complaint is made come forward and defend themselves, and let those who are making the allegations spell them out. So there's a lot of ways to reform the UN without touching the Charter, which is a very, very difficult process. And I strongly hope that we will do that. And I thank you again very much for